Hey guys, welcome back to the Fanfic Reread Project. In this episode, we are going to begin our reread of the first part of Prophs 3.0. The reason why Prophs 3.0 is being split into distinct parts is because part of what is considered Prophs 3.0 was written in 2014, and then part of it was written in 2015/16. So I'm just separating it by dates, and there are distinct, like very distinct differences between the two and the ways that they're written as well as the presentation. But I just wanted to just to explain that briefly, so you're like, well, why does this one get two parts? So we can probably actually just jump right into this. So Prophs 3.0, as I said, from 2014. There are two distinct different versions of this version of Prophs. Jesus Christ. There is the version that we're going to be reading in this episode. I'm not entirely sure how long it'll take to read this version. And then there is the second version of this, which is clearly an edited draft of this that we can cover definitely in one episode because it's only 3 chapters. So let's jump into the first version of the first version of the first version of Prophs 3.0. We, of course, will be beginning with the classic Bran chapter. The air had a bite to it as the body swayed in the wind. It still wore the tattered rags they dragged him out in when he was still alive, though the shoes were gone, revealing his ratty gray socks. His hands looked rough and calloused, but he'd still lost 3 fingers to frostbite. The rope was slung around his torso because his head was gone. The image of the beheading was burned into his mind. He hadn't averted his eyes as his father lowered the blade. He still remembered the way ice flashed in the sun, the cloudy glass blue-gray until the man's blood painted it red. Dried blood still decorated the stump at the top of his neck, flaked and rusty. So it is interesting that this begins with such a visceral image of the man that was beheaded at the execution. It's definitely different from what we've seen before, because in Prophs 2.0, we began with them at the execution itself, I think. If I'm remembering correctly, Prophs 2.0 actually began sort of in media res, but also part of the beginning of the chapter was straight up missing. So I'm not entirely sure. I remember Bran complaining about, or just talking about how his mom was upset that he was there, something like that. But here we get a distinct beginning that shows the aftermath of the execution, but we don't actually see the execution, as you'll see down the line. We only see the end result, and this was basically done just to change up the presentation of the chapter, because unlike most of the chapters in other versions of Prophs, and this one as well, this is one of the few chapters that's written from the same POV as it is in the source material. So that means that I have to work extra hard to make sure that I'm not just plagiarizing the book. So adding little changes like, oh, it starts here instead of here, are just little ways to do that. I've done that in other stories, and we can talk about that when we get to those other stories. So anyway, why do they hang it, he asked, if Dad's already chopped off his head? It's so the people of the hill will know that they're safe now, his brother Robb told him, and to warn anyone who'd try the same thing what'll happen to them. Bran broke his gaze to see that he was looking up at it as well, but with none of the revulsion he held himself. He should have expected no less. He'd been through this many times before in his 18 years. He wore the somber grays like he was conducting the execution himself. I like what that says about Robb as a character. Also, as with other versions of the Prophs reread, the characters' names are not the same as they are in the books, but I'm changing them back because it's easier for me to do that than to explain to you every time a certain character's name pops up. I'm only mentioning this now because in the next chapter there are going to be some parts that may or may not make sense with the names changed, but I'll point those out when we get to them. He had never been to one of these before, and his father had decided that now that he was 10, it was high time that he'd go. His mother protested. She still thought he was too young to see death, but father had insisted. The sooner he sees, the better he knows, and the easier he'll go, his father had said. Mother had called him morbid for it, but she didn't argue anymore. He still didn't know how he felt about it, even though it was all over now. That's why he stood in the middle of the brownstone courtyard of the castle. Okay, whatever. That's why he stood in the middle of the brownstone courtyard of Deepwood Motte, staring up at the headless form as it hung over the timber wall, turning into a black silhouette as the sky went red. That's a long sentence. He did not know how this would help him die, but it didn't scare him anymore, or at least he didn't think it did. His father called out to him, and he finally tore himself away from the thing. The sun was ablaze as they rode out of the gates. They had arrived at the castle that afternoon after a long ride through the wood that separated them. They needed his father that day, which meant that they had to travel through it instead of circumventing it by traveling east. Even leaving early in the day, they wouldn't return to Winterfell until well after nightfall. He took the long journey on a pony, surrounded by his brothers, and his father and his men on their tall horses. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's wildly unrealistic that this party would be able to travel from Winterfell all the way to Deepwood Motte in a day through the Wolfswood. We don't know the exact sizes of these places, but if you look at a map of northern Westeros, Winterfell is roughly in the middle of the north, while Deepwood Motte is on the coast. Well, not completely on the coast. It's close to the coast, like a bit south of Bear Island. It's pretty far away. It's a whole entire forest between the two castles. It's not a place that you can get to super quickly, even if you cut through the woods rather than circumventing it on horses, even if you have a small party. It doesn't seem super realistic that they were able to travel this fast. But that's like a small thing, like I said. So anyway, his half-brother, Jon Snow, had said it was strange for them to come here for this. He said that father usually did the king's justice in a field south of their castle, a rolling green on the other side of the White Knife. They'd done it there for centuries, long before the old king had kneeled to Aegon the Conqueror, but there were occasions where they would have to go elsewhere. He even remembered a time when he was young, and his father was away from home for 4 days tending to an execution at Widow's Watch. His sister, Arya, had told him that if father hadn't gone, they would have taken the man to the Dreadfort instead, and it would have gone harder for him there. Just pinned that mention of the Dreadfort and the Boltons, because the Boltons are, like, oddly always brought up at least once in all of these. For some reason, I don't know why. I guess it's a world building thing, but I think we can talk about it better when we get to the second version of this in the other episode. Another note that I wanted to make is that it's weird that apparently Jon is like, oh, well, we usually don't come there, they bring them here. And it's like, why? Why is that general? Like, I think another thing that this story kind of doesn't get is that while this isn't necessarily medieval, I do think this is supposed to be vaguely like along the lines of like the 1800s-ish. I'm not entirely sure, but it's not 100% medieval, but that still doesn't change the fact that distances and travel and communications aren't that different from what's in the actual books. Like, people still send messages by Raven and shit like that. They don't have mailmen. And they don't have trains, as far as I know, in this version, and they don't have cars. So it really does not, like, logistically make any sense that, usually people drag all of their prisoners down to this rolling field on the other side of the river, which is not where that rolling field is anyway. But apparently people from all over the north drag their prisoners down to this specific field, and we do all the executions there as if it's some, like, state-sanctioned place for killing prisoners who have broken the law. That's not what happens in the books at all. Number one, I don't even know if Jon actually says that in the books. And number two, the reason why they do the executions in that field is because usually the people breaking the law are from the area, which is why they're brought to Winterfell in the first place. For example, the guy who got executed in the actual first chapter of the books, Will, was a deserter from the Night's Watch who was found within the lands of the Serwins, who are sort of like direct underlings of the Starks. Their castle really isn't that far away. So it makes sense that Ned and his people would ride out from the castle and go execute him in the field, which is like just south of their castle, because that's the area. It's basically under their jurisdiction. But if some, like, I don't know, some random criminal steals and then murders someone in a market up in like the Gift or something, he gets either sent to the Umbers or to the Night's Watch for the execution. You don't drag him all the way down the King's Road to this random field on the other side of the White Knife so that Ned can take a day's ride out from the castle and then execute him. That doesn't make any sense. Same thing here. If this happened near Deepwood Motte, most likely the Glovers would have taken care of it. Like, they wouldn't have called Ned all the way out there unless it was like treason or something really, really important. So it's like, I understand why I had it set over here just as a way to change it, especially because in the book it was set in the lands of another person's castle. But I think I'm severely misunderstanding how feudalism works in this, and the fact that The only reason that Will was killed directly by Ned is because the Serwyn sent him a letter and said this, and they live nearby. So they can take a day's ride, go down there, do the execution, and then come back a day later and be home. And it's really not that big of a deal in terms of medieval travel times. That's basically the equivalent of a day trip for us. Deepwood Mont, on the other hand, is at least a few days ride away from Winterfell. It is pretty far. So having them go all the way through the woods and execute a guy and then leave when Galbart Glover could easily just pull out his own sword, pass the sentence, and swing it. Like, there's no reason. Same thing, like, why the hell is Ned all the way out at the Dreadfort unless it's something really, really important? Also, I think I'm severely underestimating the distance of the North itself and just the size of it when writing this, but anyway. The leaves threw patterns of moving black onto the ground as they moved into the forest again. He pushed his pony to keep up with his brothers and the ward, but he was still a step behind. Robb looked allured on his horse, and the light turned his auburn hair a deep red. He was built like their father, like a northerner, but he had their mother's hair and freckles and steely blue eyes. He was a sad sight, that one, he said, but he went bravely enough. Jon stared at him through his slate gray eyes, but Bran could not read his gaze. I'm already noting a lot of the fake antiquating by dropping contractions here. I don't know what it is about doing that, but even as recently as like 2 years ago, I caught myself doing that in works based off of not only A Song of Ice and Fire, but also in my like Pirates of the Caribbean fic, which actually I just read through the published version of that. I'm coming back and rereading this because I wasn't happy with the original one, but reading that, I even found parts where the characters are like, oh, I did not know this, when really you don't have to do that. Like, maybe they didn't back then, but I'm pretty sure contractions have been around for a long time. And in a fantasy story, especially like prophs, you don't need to worry about having characters say didn't and then be like, oh no, is that something that existed back then? There is no back then. Just write what feels right, you know? Anyway, when Pirates of the Caribbean comes out, which is actually the one directly after this, now that I think about it, for the most part, that story has really, really good examples of actual, like, quote-unquote fake antiquating that doesn't depend entirely on, like, changing the spelling or the pronunciation of words. It's more about the actual formation of the sentences and stuff. But anyway. Though he was his half-brother, he looked more Stark than any of his full-blood siblings. The birthmark that creeped up the side of his face was darker than even their father's. How do you know? Jon said. He barely moved. And it was true. When they dragged the man out, he had slumped over the petrified stump in the castle's courtyard like he was already dead. Exactly. He didn't fight his fate, Robb said back. Theon let out a chuckle, that ever-present smirk on his face. If you say so, the ward said, though I don't know how brave that is. In the deepening light, his sea-green eyes turned forest. He was of no relation to them, a Greyjoy of the Iron Islands, as the light brown marks that trailed down past his right eye attested. But he'd been around since before Bran was born, so it almost felt like he was. I thought he was half dead as it was. Did you see the bloke? He had frostbite. So, Jon said with a shrug. What kind of wilding gets frostbite? Theon continued. That would be like an Iron Man getting ship's rot, and in the summer, too. It's been summer for ages, Greyjoy, Jon reminded him. Either way, he probably lost them before he even got to the forest. It's always deep winter near the wall. And he was obviously off his rocker as well, stumbling into the village like that, Theon added. I could have told you that, Greyjoy, Robb said, rolling his eyes. He killed 3 people. Don't give me sarcasm, Stark. Bran laughed for the first time as Theon mimicked his brother's tone. But honestly, Jon said after the laughter had subsided, what do you think he said? Theon shrugged. Does it matter? He's dead now. The words always matter, Robb said. If they didn't, my father wouldn't bother to listen. This is a sort of good place to note that reading this really does just feel like a version of Bran's chapter from Prophs 2.0. Written to better integrate the names that were a thing in Prophs 3.0. I don't know how many of you actually remember this due to me changing the names back to the source material ones, but in Prophs 2.0, it was originally written with the same names that were in Prophs 1.0, so they were all in like Tolkien Elvish, with different versions of Elvish being used to represent different people from different places. Whereas Prophs 3.0, on the other hand, decided to use real world languages as ciphers for the fictional quote unquote languages, quote unquote, that exist in this world. So, for example, the people from the north, Scottish, I think, it was like a mix of Scottish and Irish, were used to represent like the tongue that they would have been speaking. People from the Riverlands, and each of these like places did sort of have their own languages, which is its own issue, but we're not going to talk about that right now. So, due to the language changes, Prophs 2.0, I kind of went back and search replaced all of the names out after I decided to do these language changes. But as you may have remembered, I would keep tripping over my words because I would see like words that were in English, things that were in like Scottish or Gaelic, I should say, but things that were still in Elvish. It was very sort of like back and forth, and you could tell it was a search replace job. So this version feels like basically taking that and actually writing in all of the different names and terms and stuff that I wanted to use. But anyway, as they trekked deeper into the woods, the red turned to purple, then purple to indigo, and indigo to black. Bran couldn't see the stars through the canopy, and the moon was too weak to reach the floor. The orange flames of their lanterns seemed like orbs floating in the dark of night. The boys had to fall back once the sun had set. They rode behind Father now, and Jory... Oh, God, his name is Jory Cassell. Jory Cassell. They rode behind Father now, and Jory Cassell, the master of the guard, and Hullen, the stable master? Okay. Every time I read this, I always get confused as to which one's Hullen and which one's Harwin. I know Harwin's the younger one, but when I see the names, I'm like the translated names, I'm like, what the fuck? I don't know. They dropped their voices so that the wolves that roamed the forest at night wouldn't hear them. He couldn't help but be a bit nervous. His sister had told him that the wolves in the wood were massive monsters with slavering jaws and fangs that could tear through bone like the ones above the wall. His lessons told him that those wolves hadn't been seen in the north for centuries, but being in the forest itself made him wonder. What if they hadn't gone extinct at all? What if they just lived so deep in the wood that they'd never been found? The wolf's wood stretched from the outlands of their castle to the shores of the ice in the east and almost touched the wall. There was no way anyone could have seen the whole thing. I mean, people literally live in that forest, Bran, but okay. So the ice is the Bay of Ice. In this story, the two bays were referred to as the Ice and the Whitewater. The Whitewater is the Bay of Seals. Also, it is worth noting that that is a change in the actual geography of the North. In the source material, there is a mountain range north of the Wolf's Wood that takes up the actual area leading up to the wall. So instead here, that mountain range was, I should say it's removed, but technically it was actually moved to the east to separate Carhold and the forest around it from the rest of the north. They are technically the same mountains, actually. But anyway, he tried to take his mind off of the wolves, but the only other thing he could think of was that wilding man who had been executed. Neither comforted him, so he chose the lesser of two evils. A dead man could not kill him, or at least that's what he'd been told. Jesus. The man was a sore sight, just like his brother had said, but there was something strange about him. He remembered when he still had his head, and he remembered the reddened sores on his face. He thought them from the cold before, and he was in no state of mind to question any different then, but when he thought back now, he thought they looked more like cuts or slashes. And where had he come from anyway? What were wildings doing that far away from the wall? He shuddered when he imagined what that man had met wandering the forests in his apparent madness. Had he met the wolves? No. If he had, surely he would already be dead. Okay, so one thing I do like about this chapter is that it is giving us some hints at the fact that something strange is going on beyond the wall. But even though we could probably guess what's going on, the characters themselves are just kind of like either oblivious, or in Bran's case, he's just like, I have no idea what this means, so I'm trying my best. I was not expecting that, and I did not remember that from the last time I read this. Especially, I like the way that this paragraph, wondering about this, is prefaced by a line that's like, oh, a dead man can't kill him, or at least that's what he's been told. It's like, oh. Yeah, I actually really like that a lot. Different versions of prophs have a different focus on the stuff that's going on beyond the wall. He didn't even know the hour when he finally saw the sky again. The sight of the stars had never been so welcome to him before. They turned on the King's Road, and Winterfell was not far now. He couldn't wait to get back to his room. He thought he would fall right into his bed. The gates of the castle were like towering shadows as they finally passed them and entered the grounds again. The castle was lit up as if the night were still early and not nearing the morning. His mother was particularly worried about them on this outing. It must be her doing. They came to a stop in front of the stables, and he hopped off of his horse eagerly. His legs felt bowed under him, but he found his footing easily enough. When he looked up, he could see Arya in her window in the tower. He was surprised that she was awake and that she wasn't downstairs. He'd started toward the huge oak doors of the castle when a yell stopped him. So some quick maths. I decided that since it was low summer, meaning that summer is starting to near its end, but essentially speaking, since it's almost autumn, we can be generous and say that they left Deepwood Mott sometime around like 7 at night, maybe 8, and they're getting home what seems to be, he says it's nearing morning, so it must be almost midnight. That's not nearly long enough. Like 5 hours, really, on horseback? With one person riding a pony? I don't think so. Anyway. It was Harwin, Hullen's son, and it was toward his father. My lord, he continued, this didn't come from any of our animals. We'd have noticed. Bran didn't know what he meant, but he got a bad feeling instantly. I should go inside, he thought. I've seen enough for one day, but his curiosity was winning out. He wove his way back into the small group of men until he found his brothers again. He didn't even have to ask what it was Harwin saw. The bloodstain was clear as day on the dirt in front of him. What could have done that, his father wondered out loud, probably voicing more than a few of their thoughts. As if in response, a loud wail of a howl cut through the air. It wasn't anything like the dogs in the kennels, or the wolves you could hear in the wolfswood at night. It sliced through him like a hot knife in butter and shook him to his core. All of them turned in the direction it had come from and stared directly at the gates to the Godswood. His father did not hesitate to go toward the noise, and his brothers and Theon and Harwin didn't hesitate to follow behind him. Bran went along after a moment, and when he looked down, he saw that the blood was following the same path he was. The moon was only a sliver of gray in the sky, but as soon as he passed the ironwood walls, its light turned as silver as full. He followed them through the tall stands of oaken sentinels and pines until they reached the only significant clearing in the place. There was only one tree here, the heart, a massive black tree with twisting limbs that reached up toward the heavens. They called it the bleeding tree, for its sap stained everything bloody red. The only thing it didn't touch was the pool that formed at the tree's front, and it shone deep midnight blue in the moon's light. Shone? I use shone as like a past tense of shine, but I don't think that's how that works. Also, oh no, it's spelled wrong. That's the problem. Once he reached this spot, the trail of blood disappeared, blending in with the already reddened ground. His father had already spotted the body, however. There was a dark shape slumped on the ground under the tree, something huge and covered in fur. Jory pulled out his sword and approached it first, but they all soon realized, whatever it was already dead. Robb let out a bloody hell when he got up to it. Is it really a version of prophs if someone doesn't say bloody hell when they find the dead wolf? When he finally saw it himself, he let out a gasp. It was a wolf, a huge thing, even bigger than his pony. Its eyes still lay open, but they had rolled back into its head. The thing's mouth was pulled back into what looked like a snarl, and its huge teeth were yellowed in their black gums. Part of its gray fur was matted with blood, but it hadn't dried completely yet. When Jory reached down and touched the thing, he declared, "It's still warm." "It's so big," Robb said in awe. "It's a freak," Theon hissed. "It's a dire wolf," Harwin corrected. "That's impossible," Theon remarked. "Obviously not," Robb said. Theon shot him a look. The thing about dialogue where it's just like short sentences, if you stick dialogue tags at the end of it, it starts to get repetitive. It's better to just jump back and forth between the lines, you know? And even then, you're still kind of running a risk, but anyway. Bran was frozen as Jory repeated the same thing he'd been thinking earlier. They've been extinct below the wall for ages. Why did they say below the wall and not south of the wall? Anyway. "There's nothing else it could be," Harwin said. "It's too big to be anything else." Bran's voice was caught in his throat. He was right. But how could he be? Before he could think of any suitable answer for himself, a tiny whimper pulled him from his thoughts. He looked to Jon, who was on the other side of the corpse with something in his hands. It looked like a little ball of fur from where he was, but he knew right away it was a cub. He shook himself out of his shock and inched over there as Jory inspected the body. Up close, it was bigger than he'd thought. It had curled itself tightly into Jon's arms. Its body moved rapidly with its quick breaths, and its eyes were still closed. "He's the same color as Robb's hair, isn't he?" asked quietly. Bran nodded. He really was the same shade of red-brown. Jon blinked a few times and then said, "You can pet him if you want." Bran couldn't account for the change in his voice, but he ignored it as he took off his glove. The fur was warm and soft under his hand. "Are there more?" he asked. John nodded. There were 3 others, he said, pointing to the ground. The others were there, huddled against each other. He picked up another, one that was a light gray that went right around his eyes. It curled into him the same way the other had into his brother, and he smiled for the 2nd time that day. It was a lion, Jory finally said. When he looked back up again, he saw that the body had been flipped on its back, revealing a terrifying wound in its neck that left the flesh torn and ragged, and the innards on the ground where it had been before. What innards? It's a neck. What the fuck? Jesus. He grimaced. I've seen the bite marks before, but they've never been known to travel this far north, and it shouldn't have given her any trouble. A dire wolf south of the wall after all these years, and it's killed by a lion, Harwin said with a shake of the head. We don't take stock in omens, Father said firmly. Either way, I'm surprised she lived long enough to whelp, Jory said, gesturing toward the pups in their arms. What are we going to do with them? Father shook his head. They'll have to go. What? Bran said, clutching the pup a little tighter. They'll die even if we don't, he told him. Better to not let them suffer. Can't we keep them? Bran asked. A direwolf is no pet, child, Jory told him. When that thing is full grown, it'll be able to rip you apart. Not if we train them. He looked down when Father turned his dark gray eyes on him. Bran, we've no choice. Father, is it only coincidence that this direwolf died in our godswood? Robb said. He was holding the one that Jon had now. It graces our banners, he reminded him. And there are 4 of them, my lord, Jon added. 1 for each of your children. They were meant to have them. And what about you? Father asked. I'm no Stark. Bran's eyes widened. Did he really leave himself out to make the numbers even? He couldn't believe it. His father looked down at the 2 pups remaining on the ground and then back at the 2 in their arms. Fine then. You'll raise them yourselves, feed them yourselves, and train them yourselves. Don't pass them off to the kennel master, and God's help you if you mistreat them. He paused to take a deep breath. Are you sure you still want this? Yes, Bran answered eagerly. Robb nodded in agreement. Gather the other 2 then. God's help you when your mother catches sight of them. And that's the end of that chapter. So, that was fine. The writing style of this chapter kind of bothered me, mostly because it's really wordy. Like, there are plenty of sentences where it could have just been like, a character does this and then some type of adjective, but instead it's like, a character does this because blah, 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 and it's just like, shut up. But for what it is, it's passable, it works, it does what it needs to do, it's readable. I think this chapter actually does start to highlight a trend that is common throughout this specific version of prophs. Which is the fact that chapters are from certain characters' POVs, but you don't really see the reason why because the chapter doesn't feel like it's actually about them. This entire chapter begins with telling us that this is Bran's first execution. He is going here because his father has decided that it's high time he's seen one, and he thinks it'll help him understand some things about life later on. Yet, number 1, I cut out the little lesson that Bran has with Ned when Ned asks him why he executed the person himself. That was kind of important for establishing something not just about Bran and what he's learning, but about the Stark family in general. Number 2, we think about the dead man and stuff, but at the end of the day, Bran doesn't relate it back to himself or what he's going through or been through at all. He doesn't really spend that much time thinking about it outside of while he's looking at it, and then when he's wondering what the weird wounds on the guy's face came from. The most important conversation about the guy happens between the 3 older boys, and while this is consistent throughout the other versions, it just feels like Bran is not included in the chapter all that much. It just feels like he's kind of there. Now, I will say this chapter does do a better job of including Bran's thoughts about things than some of the other chapters, as we'll say, but there's still a distinct feeling that Bran is kind of a spectator in a chapter that's supposed to be about him and his character, and that's kind of not okay. One last thing about the other chapter is the logistics of the wolf dying in the Godswood. It's just not very realistic. For some reason, it took me years, literal years, to realize that in a castle, the gates of the castle don't just sit open. There are actual men who stand at the gates and open and close them depending on if people are coming or going. This is something that goes all the way back to Prophs 1.0. Like, if you remember that very, very, very first Jon chapter we ever read, when Jon literally sneaks out of Winterfell through the front door and no one stops him except Theon comes up to him and is like, "What are you doing?" Like, that's it. And this, for some reason, it just never dawned on me that, maybe the reason why castles have gates is to keep people out. So the gates don't just stay open until like a battle happens. They're closed all the time. It's like if you leave your front door not just unlocked, but you leave the screen door propped open all the time. Like, why would you do that? This is the only version of the chapter where the wolf actually dies on castle grounds, because I realized after this that made no sense. How did the wolf get on the grounds without no one noticing? And what killed her so badly that she made it onto the castle grounds, died, and the thing that killed her is nowhere to be seen, But anyway, so on to this John chapter. The day had dawned bright and clear, but the sun still seemed to amplify once it touched the arms of the heart. John's eyes were already starting to hurt from squinting. John sat at the edge of the pool staring into the water, turned green in the light. The thing was so clear now he could see straight to the bottom, and it didn't reflect a thing. It wasn't like the night when you could see every star across the calm, dark surface. He never understood why it did that. Yeah, and we'll never have it explained in the story. The pool, at the very least in the old version of Prophs, there was something significant about the pool, possibly. Because from the looks of it, the necklace seems to teleport itself. I really hope people listening to this have listened to the Prophs 2.0 series, because good lord, you're not going to know what I'm talking about. But it did seem like the pool had some type of magical quality. In this version, maybe it's just not long enough that we got into that, but nothing happens with this pool of water. So spending an entire half a paragraph talking about it just seems pointless. He said, toying with the chain at his neck, I was half lying when I said that. What? Rob said back. You saw how bad Bran wanted to keep them. Rob eyed him from his place on the rock beside him, the same one their father sat on when he washed his greatsword. The sun had turned his hair blood red, and his eyes shined like the steel of his blade. He looked absolutely kingly. But you were right, he argued. How could you possibly know? Theon asked. He'd come down to the Godswood with them, almost out of habit, though he didn't keep their gods. I thought you all didn't take stock in omens. It's not an omen. Omens foretell bad things, Rob told him, scratching his pup on the head. There's nothing bad about this. I love that, because omens do not foretell bad things. They just foretell things. And what about that neck wound, then? He shook his head. It doesn't mean anything. Every time I read this, I'm always struck by how little weight Rob puts into the neck wound, but how much weight he put into the fact that the wolf died under the heart tree. That seems like kind of hypocritical of him. I guess maybe that's the point, though, in which case I kind of like that. That's nice, because it shows the character isn't perfect. But it's hard reading it only because in later versions, Rob being superstitious and putting weight into every single thing that happened to this wolf is like a big part of his character, and it's also a commentary on Northern society as a whole, because a lot of people in the North are like this. But we can talk about that more when we get to the second version of this. Brother, a voice came from the trees. Rob sat up. Yes, Sansa? She edged into the clearing slowly, and her hair seemed to catch fire once the sun hit it. She was a willowy girl of 13, the spitting image of her lady mother, but with large silvered eyes instead of Lady Catelyn's steely blue. Did you come by yourself? He asked. No, I brought Lady with me. When he looked again, he could see the little thing padding along behind her. She was the smallest of the litter and had opened her eyes last. He couldn't believe that she could have led Sansa all the way there. She didn't even have a lead. A lead as in a leash. Have you heard? Mother says the king is coming. They were taken aback, save for Theon, who stared at Rob with a raised eyebrow. How do you know that? Jon asked. I heard her tell father, half-brother. Of course she had. Sansa could hear almost anything. She says the queen is coming too, she told them airily. And the princess and the princess? Did she already tell? Someone else said. Bran appeared from the trees with his pup, and then Arya's behind him. I was going to tell them. It doesn't matter, Sansa said loftily. Where is Arya? Did she tell you about Lord Aaron too? What about him? Rob said. That's none of your business, Sansa hissed. What happened? Rob asked again. She's just going to tell them anyway, Bran reasoned. He opened his mouth to explain, but just then Arya burst into the clearing. Look what I found, she shouted excitedly. Look, look! She had a pup in her arms, black as the shadows, and another trailed on behind her, white as snow. I was just about to tell them. It can wait, she said dismissively. Jesus Christ. How did you miss two more? She asked as she sat under the tree. Bran sat down next to her defeatedly. They had the same combination of their parents' features, their father's deep brown hair and birthmark, and their mother's round face and eyes. Though they were a year apart, they could pass for twins. This wood is older than the castle and denser than the wolf's wood, Rob said. They could have crawled away. Jon raised an eyebrow. Before their eyes opened? Who said their eyes weren't open? Rob said back with a smirk. He always was superstitious. Okay, what? Okay, number one, you can't say Rob was always superstitious when Theon is like, well, what does the neck wound mean? And then Rob blows it off as nothing. Like, what? It even flies sort of in the face of what I was saying before, the hypocrisy of being like, oh, this means something, but this thing that I don't really understand or I don't want to think about doesn't mean anything. I guess I could see how he could think that, but still, it's weird. Also, I'm still not entirely sure what that means. Like, what is superstitious about thinking that the wolf's eyes were open before all the other ones? What does that mean? I feel like that line is supposed to be significant, but I don't get it. What do we do with them then? As if in response, the black one came right up to Theon and plopped down lazily at his feet. Well, that's settled, Rob said with a laugh. I guess that one's yours then, he said, indicating the pup that was staring up at him now. His big eyes shone bright red. But I don't, John started. Rob stopped him before he could get any further. Please, he said offhandedly, not a Stark, my arse. Okay, so this chapter has a real problem with the pronoun game because you can't say he said referring to Rob and then like directly after it say he said referring to John. It's like, you cannot do that. What will you call yours? Arya asked him. I've decided to call mine Ava. Like the river? Bran asked her. Like the woman, Arya corrected. Really? Sansa scoffed. That's barbaric. It is not, Arya said, narrowing her eyes. Why the Bolton woman? Theon asked. So she'll be strong, Arya told him. She will be, Rob told her. He leaned back on the rock and scratched his pup's chin. I've decided to call mine Greywind, he told them. Now that's a good name, Sansa said. He'll be as strong as our Lord Father. Mine will too. Rob stepped in then. Stop it, you two. Okay, so I want to pause here. Number one, I've explained this in other rereads, but for people who are coming into this brand new, in this version of the story, Arya's wolf being called Nymeria doesn't make sense because her wolf is named after a person who doesn't actually exist in the books and who is a member of House Bolton. So I used the name that she actually has in this version of the story instead of just putting in Nymeria, especially because as you'll see, some of the stuff that Sansa is saying, it comes off as racist when it's not supposed to be like that if you have her be named Nymeria. I think the problem is that I want to explain who Ava is, but I never actually defined her as a character. The reason why Sansa's always like, oh, it's barbaric, is because she's a Bolton, and the Boltons sort of have a reputation, as in the books, for being sort of like shifty and weird and kind of violent. But in prophs, the Boltons are staunch allies of the Starks, so while they're seen as violent, a lot of people just kind of like accept it because it's like, well, they're violent for us, you know? There are creepy weirdos, you know? But Sansa, being more southerly oriented like her mom, is sort of like, ew, ew, you know? Whereas Arya sees that and it's like, yeah, she's cool. But anyway. Septim Ordain does say that pets take after their owners, Sansa sniffed. It's her fault if she goes feral and maims us all. She won't, Arya muttered. She'll only come for you. You little... Stop. His voice was commanding, his being Rob. He had a penchant for channeling his Lord Father when dealing with his sisters. They both fell silent. I don't know what to call mine, Bran said absently. That's all right, Jon said. It's only been a day. But how will I call him? Theon shrugged. Point at him and say you. Rob narrowed his eyes at him. What about you, then, Greyjoy? What will you call yours? The pup lay on its back, staring up at the tangle of branches above them with icy blue eyes. It was hard to tell whether he was entranced or bored. Shadow, he decided immediately. That's morbid, Sansa said, wrinkling her nose. That's another one of those ones where translating the name kind of doesn't make sense, but Mordred just means shadow, I'm pretty sure, so there's no reason not to. Theon tapped Jon on the head. What about yours, Snow? He was silent for a minute. Names flicked through his head, any number of them, but there was one that stuck on his mind. When he looked up at him with his bright red eyes, he knew for sure. Ghost. Morbid, Sansa repeated again. I like it, Rob said. Jon smiled. There was no better name for his pup. Now, Bran, what were you saying about Lord Aaron? And that's the end of that chapter. So I think this chapter does show off more the issue with this, where these chapters are clearly not about the POV characters in any way, shape, or form, and it's very, very strange. Jon is such a non-entity in this chapter. Like, you could have literally, like, written him out of the chapter, and you would have missed nothing. Even more so here, you can tell that this chapter, part of it, gets hijacked by the original pup naming chapter from Prophs 2.0. from the part where Arya shows up all the way to the end, it's basically a cut and paste, literally actually a cut and paste version of the pup naming chapter from the previous version of the story. The stuff up to that point is not super interesting either. It doesn't tell us anything about the characters except, I guess, Rob's kind of superstitious, but only when he thinks it's like worth stuff, and Theon is skeptical. We got that, but then John's just kind of there. Now, the thing about it is that John just kind of being there should be a thing that says something about his character, but here it just feels like he's there. It doesn't make a statement about anything, where again, it should have been a comment on his character as opposed to Theon and Rob, who are sort of having like conversations back and forth and stuff. But yeah, I guess it does what it needs to do. I actually would say I don't like this chapter. At least the Bran chapter, I could read through it. I see what I was trying to do there, even though I don't think it was super successful. It wasn't terrible. It just had some questionable decisions in it. This chapter, on the other hand, I feel like I started phoning it in part of the way through, and I really feel like I should have just rewrote it completely. I guess it works. It does what it needs to do, but that's the other thing is like, what is this chapter? What's the point of this chapter? You start out with like the characters talking about what all of this means, and like, we found the wolves. What are the omens? And that's interesting. And then Sansa shows up and it's like, oh, the king's coming. And then Bran shows up and is like, oh, did you hear about Lord Aaron? But we immediately get taken away from that for an entire extended scene talking about, oh, look, we found these other two wolves, which in and of itself would be fine, but then it just keeps going and talking about, well, what are we going to name it? And all this other stuff. Does not seem relevant at the moment at all. Like, I feel like, to an extent, there's a reason why in the source material George R.R. Martin didn't have the kids sit down for an entire chapter from like anyone's POV and name the wolves, because it's like, we don't need to see that necessarily. Or at least in this case, we don't. I think the wolf naming chapter actually worked better in the original version because it worked to show off the dynamics between the characters. Here, it falls flat for me, mostly because I know that I just took this and this was just an excuse to change the setting and see if that would change anything, and it didn't. It feels pointless. It feels like this chapter, like I said, got hijacked by the older chapter, and I don't like that. But anyway, so now that the recording of this is 50 minutes in, I am going to stop here. Next episode, we will begin with the first of like, what, 2-ish Arya chapters. From this point out, I'm pretty sure the only POVs in the story again are now Bran and Arya. We can talk about that at the end, and why the breadth of characters in this really isn't that big. I don't want to get into it right now because we need to end this. So, like I said, next episode, Arya chapter, I will see you for that. If you like this episode, like it on the YouTubes, subscribe so you'll be updated when the next episode comes out, or whatever the next episode is when you are watching this when that comes out. It would also be very helpful if you guys would go back and watch the backlog. You can catch up on the previous prophs rereads, as well as listening to some of the other rereads that I've done at this point. We're kind of far along, so I have a few under my belt at this point. You can also watch some of the videos that aren't necessarily reread related. Whatever you want to do, it would just be very helpful. And like I said, I will see you for the next episode. Bye!